these pics, so don't worry about that. It's time to have a bit of a chat and I guess get into the meat of what we're talking about here today, HDR particularly, what that means for the film and TV industry. And with us, and you've already heard from Patrick, we have two experts that are not only revolutionising the industry with their own work, but can see the future and are on board with the future and are driving that future as well. So I'll bring Patrick up in a moment, but let me just give you a little bit of a bio because it is very, very impressive. He's the Vice President of Technology for Dolby Laboratories, one of the world's leaders in audiovisual technologies. Patrick is one of the leading lights in consumer technology, particularly in the home entertainment space. He served 2 terms as President of the IEEE, the Consumer Electronics Society, and is a member of numerous other leading industry committees. He's also an expert on the subject of picture quality, serving on the board of the Ultra HD Forum, and is Dolby's board alternate in the UHD Alliance, as well as chair of the Compliance and Certification Working Group. And he's also earned 8 patents in TV product design as well, and we might ask his favourite one. So please welcome Patrick Griffis. Thank you for joining us. What is your favourite patent, actually? What's your highlight?
Well, going way back, I used to work at RCA Consumer Electronics Division, and there was a time when there wasn't stereo in televisions, or even Dolby 5.1. One of my first patents was a way of taking mono sound and synthesizing stereo, and it actually worked pretty well.
Wow, there you go.
And the mark of a good patent, I guess you call it down here, a patent in the US, is that people actually licensed it from RCA. So I was very proud of that.
There you go. So I did mention you are driving the future and continue to do that. Thank you so much for joining us. You've only been here for 24 hours, is that right?
Right.
And you go back tomorrow?
I do.
I apologise for the weather. We've had 8 weeks of beautiful weather. Dry, sunny, and I'm so sorry, but it's been horrible the last 48 hours. Hopefully it'll turn today. It's sunny out there, isn't it? I haven't been outside yet. Okay, and I mentioned before as well, and we're very lucky to have him, one of Australia's leading cinematographers. Peter James has worked on more than 30 feature films. His portfolio spans all genres, from period drama through comedy and even 3D. Peter is 4-time winner of ACS's Australian Cinematographer of the Year award and has been director of photography on such films as Mao's Last Dancer. This is my daughter's favourite film at the moment. I mentioned that to Peter before. Meet the Parents and Walking with Dinosaurs. He's a member of the Academy Oscar and sits on the American Society of Cinematographers Committee on HDR TV. So there's no better person to talk about HDR than these two men here. Please welcome Peter James. Sit down, Peter. I'm going to start with you because we've heard Patrick's take on HDR and what it means for LG TV as well in the partnership with Dolby Vision. But for you, explain what HDR is.
Well, it's a hard thing. It's an easy thing to understand really, because it's really, if you look at your eyesight, you can see this much tonal range, and you can look at a cloud and you can see the shape of the cloud, and you can look at somebody's jacket, which is black, you can see the folds in the black. Film never did that. We used to use filters to polarize the sky, to bring out shadow of the clouds, to bring them into the tonal range of the film stock. Video was even worse. It was the range in video was down around here. It was just very, very restricted. So you had to make everything very flat and uniform to capture a grayscale or to make it look normal, to make it look more like what the eye sees. Film had a lot more range than video, but now the new video cameras, the range is extended even further. It's gone out from 12 stops, photographic stops, to 14 photographic stops, which is pretty damn good. But when you put it onto a television set, you don't get anywhere near that. You're probably only getting around about 7 stops of tonal range, unless you manipulate the image to fit inside that 7-stop box. So with this extended range, it gives us much more naturalistic to what we actually do. it's more like what we're photographing than anything else we've ever had in the past.
I'm going to ask you about what that means for the creative, what that means for selecting locations for films, and also maybe I might get you to look back through your catalogue and pick a film that you shot a while ago that you would have loved to have shot in HDR as well. Patrick, the importance of HDR, you talk about stereo sound and how mainstream that is now, but the importance of HDR.
Well, I often say, particularly when talking to folks in Hollywood, the business folks, and trying to explain the technology, there's really three ways to make a better picture. One is more pixels. We get that higher spatial resolution, and we're getting to the point now where we're reaching the limit of the human eye. Then, of course, if you have motion, which Peter likes in his movie, you know, if you move the camera, you get motion blur. And how do you fix that? You send more frames per unit time, hence the interest in higher frame rate from folks like James Cameron, Peter Jackson. And we think of that as more pixels per unit time. You know, that's faster pixels. So more resolution, more pixels, higher frame rate, faster pixels. And then HDR is really about what I think of as better pixels, making every pixel better no matter how many or how fast you're sending them. And by better, as Peter was mentioning, you know, brighter whites, blacker blacks, brighter colors within the available palette. And then the holy grail is trying to get closer, as I was showing, to the limit of all the colors we as human beings can see. A lot of them are very interesting, like the cyans of the South Pacific are very hard to reproduce. I volunteered to go on a field trip to check that out, and so far no one's taken me up on it. Or lightsabers, or very bright colors. So it's really exciting times. Making every pixel better is something that people really, as you saw in Grant's video, people actually see the blacker blacks and the richer colors. So we think HDR is the most exciting thing to come along in a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Grant, if it's good enough for Liam Neeson, it's good enough for me. Gimmickry is so often bandied about in the TV industry, isn't it? Gimmicks, trying to sell things. HDR is not that, is it?
Well, I think just based on what Peter and Patrick have just said, this is actually a real innovation and something which we think will provide some real added value for consumers when they're watching things in their lounge room. So we're really excited about it. We've got a range of TVs which have it on the OLED and the Super UHD. And we'll be talking a lot about it. I think you'll hear a lot about it this year as well across the industry. But this is something we think is here, and it's not just a TV movement. Everyone in the industry is getting on board. And I think that's why it's so exciting for us.
I was at City Gear Expo last year in Los Angeles, and the big talk there was HDR, and but there was a couple of little examples of it, but I didn't think we'd ever have it as a consumer item so quickly. So it's I'm rather surprised that it's here.
Yeah, I think
you've got this so early, you know.
Yeah, and when we launched 4K TVs a number of years ago, the big question then was when's the 4K content coming? And we're now starting to see that come through. But we're talking about HDR today and Dolby Vision, and you can go home and watch it tonight in Australia on Netflix. So I think that lag time is much reduced, and that's, again, I think a really positive thing that we can talk to consumers about. They're not having to wait for content. I think we'll see a lot more coming. It's fantastic.
Patrick, my daughter is going to be horrified to know that the more knits, the better, along with her schoolmates. But take us through that, because brightness is not the be-all and end-all, is it?
No, as I was trying to explain, you know, I tend to think of it as the color volume and the ability, the palette that Peter uses, whether it's a camera or the palette that's on the OLED TVs. That's the real key, and having that contrast ratio, as Grant mentioned, is really, really important. And so brightness helps, but remember, these OLED TVs are already 6 times brighter than the standard televisions. And now with the extra contrast in the blacks, you really get a very good picture. So yes, nits help, and we want brighter colors as well as brighter whites and blacker blacks. And I think that's what makes a big difference here.
Take us deeper into the misconception of brightness in the marketplace at the moment when it comes to HDR.
Oh, look, I tried to cover that in my presentation. But for us, the real thing about HDR is trying to get people to understand that it's about the contrast of the light and dark areas and the volume of colour So, look, this is something which I think we're going to have to educate consumers about. It's not a necessarily easy topic to get your head around, but this is the start of HDR. We'll be hearing a lot more about it. I think once you start, for me the easiest way to explain is to actually show people. And the demos that we have there to show people, I think, are very instructive. But we're at the start of, I guess, a learning journey, I guess, for the consumer. We want to definitely be part of that.
Peter, in terms of the creative, what does HDR mean for you?
Well, I think dynamic range is way more important than resolution. I've shot films where I've only used half the amount of Mouse Last Dancer for the China footage. I only used half the negative area and then blew it up. So I wanted a reduced resolution deliberately, creatively. That was the choice, and I changed the palette. That was a creative decision too, to give the China footage an older feeling. So we do things like that from an artistic point of view, but everybody goes on about 4K, and 4K is good, but you need a really big set to see 4K. I'm very in favour of large format capture and all these sorts of things. I push that, 65 mil, I push that thing all the time. But on a TV, you don't really see it. But what you do see is the dynamic range. And in a picture where you've got a high dynamic range, there's an apparent sharpness, there's apparent clarity, there's apparently more definition. It looks more defined because it tricks the eye. It shows the contrast is there, and contrast equals sharpness.
Does this open up the world in so many more ways in terms of shooting on location? Are there so many more locations that you'll be able to utilise?
Oh, well, yeah, definitely. With the cameras now having a 14 T-stop range, you can do a documentary or a sports event or something where you're not lighting it. Like normally I have these big bounce scrims, 20-foot square. You have a couple of them, you have lights. And that's every time you set up a shot, you'd have these with, generators and a whole lot of kit and a lot of guys to move it around. Now you can go out virtually with nothing and get the same result, which is, being an old school kind of guy, I find this rather staggering to be able to take these pictures and get them back in the post-production into the DI and come up with an image, which is what I would have tried, would have normally had to throw in a lot of light at it to make it look good. So therefore, documentaries where there's no lighting, sports where there's no lighting, these sorts of things would really benefit from this type of thing. But at the other end, on the theatrical side, films where you're doing a mystery or a thriller or something where you've got a very dark image and a lot of the action's taking place in the shadows and in the low end, you can now see it we're capturing it on our cameras, but when you put it onto standard definition televisions, you don't see it. You're missing all this information's off the edge of the TV. It's dropped off.
I just wanted to add to what Peter was saying about the human eye, and the color science supports our eyes have a contrast sensitivity function, and indeed when there's higher contrast, we perceive that as a sharper image. Even if it's the same number of pixels, take two images side by side, one with higher contrast, the edges are sharper, our eyes detect those edges as resolution. So same number of pixels spatially, but it appears to be a sharper image only because it has better contrast. So the two do go together.
But it's not just contrast in this case. It's not reducing the amount of grayscale. It's actually expanding the grayscale. So therefore, you've got it's like a more detailed contrast. It's almost like a heightened contrast, but it's not heightened contrast. It's a more dynamic range. Your whites are whiter, your blacks are blacker, so you've expanded your contrast range.
So Patrick, in your opinion, what is the best content at the moment in HDR?
Well, I recently had the privilege of seeing The Revenant, which those of you who watch the Oscars, Chivo, that's what we call him, Emmanuel Lubezki, won Oscar for the best director of best cinematography for that movie. He did a grade of that movie in Dolby Vision for cinema. I was sorry to hear there isn't a Dolby cinema down here in Australia yet, but I'm going to do my dangest to get it. So help me.
Bring it on.
I'd love to see it.
I got to see it in the cinema in Burbank, and he spent 10 days at our color grading facility. We have a theater, and graded that movie in Dolby Cinema, which is twice as bright as normal cinema, so 100 nits, so close to what television is, but it has a 1,000,000 to 1 contrast ratio, and so like these OLEDs, when the screen goes black, you can't see it. And he took advantage of that in one of the scenes. He did a fade to black, and for the first time ever in a movie theater, I couldn't see where I was, and he did that deliberately because in the next scene, he was gradually controlling your iris and bringing your eyes up. And that kind of creative capability has never been there before, and he did a fabulous job. It's a horribly depressing movie, but you get sucked into it. So it was great. So I think that was a movie that took a good advantage of the dynamic.
I saw a Blu-ray of that they sent for judging for the Academy, and I couldn't believe, even without an OLED screen, I could see what he was trying to do and what dynamic range he was playing in the very low end. At the same time, it's dark, it's cold, and in the woods and all that sort of stuff. And then at the same time, you could see the detail in the sunset, in the clouds, in the sky. It's wonderful. And detail in flames and fire. It's really good.
This is the perfect segue. Take me back through your catalogue of films and pick one that you would have loved to have done with HDR technology.
Oh, well, right on. The Black Robe was a film I did in Canada maybe about 20 years ago. And it's about the Jesuits and the Indians in 1300s or 1500s in Quebec. And it starts in the autumn and goes through to the middle of winter. And we follow this priest and a young boy, Aidan Young, who paddle with the Indians back to find a mission that they had heard from all summer. And the dynamic range in that photography was quite extreme because of the weather conditions and the snow and the woods and the priest wearing a black cape most of the way through it. I'd love to finish that. I would dearly love to get that now and put all that information from the film into a high dynamic range.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like some of those scenes from Revenant, especially in the winter time.
It's very similar. It's an earlier period than Relevant. It's very dramatic. You have like the Indians and the fights and that sort of stuff. It's quite spectacular.
Peter brings up a very good point. In terms of back catalogues, is there the possibility of using Dolby Vision to regrade those films?
Oh yeah, in the US there's a service now from Voodoo that has 30, 33, 35 movies going up every day in Dolby Vision that are streaming today. And they're Warner Brothers titles, but we expect Sony and others coming soon. So I think going forward, every new cinematic release is going to have an HDR grade, and Hollywood's kind of rejiggering their production system to support that. And it's not actually a big change. The same workflows are in place. For stuff in the catalog, if you have a good negative that was properly exposed, we've seen movies like some of the Clint Eastwood movies. His DP did a great job of exposing them. You can go back, take the film negative, get the original, and you can actually do a really good job. And it's almost like a new movie when you get the full dynamic range. So the good news, if it was exposed properly, you do well. We've learned, I used to say, oh, any movie that you have a film negative would be a good candidate. But you know those big westerns of the 60s and 70s, like the John Wayne Western, and he's walking in and there's a shadow because the sun is behind him, right? But he walks up to the camera and suddenly you can see his face. we never thought about, well, what happened to the sun? Well, what happens is the whole scene is lit, you know, at full brightness, and the scene itself had no dynamic range, so it's kind of hard to go back to those old films. But I think there's lots of good stuff in the catalog.
I disagree. I think you would find if you went back to the original negatives, the information's in there. It's locked in the old negative. What happened was that the prints, a film had about a 12-stop dynamic range, and a print only had a 7-stop dynamic range. So there's a lot of wastage there. You know, it just never got onto the old film print. So to take one of my, like to take Black Road with its 12-stop dynamic range and put it onto a 14-stop dynamic range, which is what we're basically working with now in a palette, a different palette, would be spectacular.
The history, the exciting thing, I guess, about HDR is that history, is the fact that over that time, over that development, you've always wanted this. You've always wanted to make it happen. You've always wanted your viewers to see it the way you see it, and now they're starting to. And Grant, this is significant, isn't it? Because demand is only going to get more and more.
Yeah, I think so. Like, as I said, I think this is a new feature which once people understand what it is, and then they realise they can get access to it and watch it, there'll be a lot of interest in it, and which I guess leads me on to a question for you, Patrick.
Sure.
You're talking about the back catalogue, but the streaming service, I guess, which is of most interest to Australians is Netflix.
Yes.
It's done very well. We were one of the first brands to launch with it last year in March, but I just wanted to see if you could share any insight into what might be coming down the track with Netflix that we can maybe feast our eyes on.
Oh, you wanted to get me in trouble, do you? Well, you mentioned the Daredevil series and Marco Polo. Netflix, their offices are about 10 miles from our offices in Sunnyvale, down in the valley where I work, and they are completely jazzed about HDR and the prospects. So I think what you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other series. All the Netflix originals are potential candidates. I've been begging them to do House of Cards. I love House of Cards. Love Kevin Spacey, for those who have ever seen it. So I think the best is yet to come. We're only at the very beginning. So we're really excited to be partnering with them and you. And so I think that combination is going to make great content.
Fantastic. And the other question I've got for you is, we talk about HDR and Dolby Vision, and I tried to explain the difference between Dolby Vision and just HDR, which was the frame-by-frame optimization. And I'd really love to get your take on that as well, because that's what we think is going to set Dolby Vision apart from generic HDR.
Yeah, well, we put HDR on the map a couple of years ago. We've been big believers in it, so we've done a lot of work and gone through a lot of the scenarios of how you're going to make it work practically in a world where now suddenly you've taken the lid, if you will, off the top of the color volume. And when we do the mastering, whether it's a Hollywood title, or for OTT, we capture information on a scene-by-scene basis about where every pixel is sitting in that color volume. And I tend, when I explain to the Hollywood folks, think of it as a cloud of mosquito pixels flying up and down based on the scene-by-scene. And in Dolby Vision, we analyze every pixel and provide information about it so that when it comes to your OLED TVs, or the LCDs for that matter, there's information about the scene metrics that the TV then uses to properly render the content, preserving artistic intent. Because one of the things we're passionate about in Dolby, whether it's for audio or image, is preserving artistic intent of the creatives and trying to give that best representation. So that's unique about Dolby Vision. Some people call it dynamic metadata. I tend to prefer to think of it as scene-by-scene metadata that optimizes the experience. That's something that only Dolby does. In addition, we take, and this goes back to the work when we were first creating the standards, working with all the Hollywood studios, we realized to be sure that you have no artifacts under any set of content conditions, Dolby Vision works in 12 bits. And the generic HDR you talked about is 10-bit only. But we found if you have CGI content, which has no noise, because it's 16-bit floating point, it's actually got much, much more dynamic range than any natural content. So movies like Inside Out, animations, Jungle Book, which is coming from Disney, you want that extra precision to avoid artifacts. And Dolby Vision supports 12 bits. It supports that scene-based metadata, and those two combined map it correctly to any particular TV color line. So we think that's what sets us apart. Dolby Vision is a superset of everything that's out there. That's why we're pleased to be with you.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I'm going to ask you at the end, Patrick, if you see a VHS Betamax competition arising with Dolby Vision amongst other HDR competitors as well in a moment. But I just wanted to ask you, Peter, very quickly, like we've seen with DSLR and still photography, will HDR make the average director of photography a hell of a lot better?
Well, no. Just because you own a 5D, it doesn't make you a cinematographer. You're not a director. Well, you think you're a director. You think you're a director of photography, but no, another 8 years of school you might be. But this is well, everybody's a bloody expert now, aren't they? Everybody's got a camera. Everybody's got a digital camera, and they're all trying to do your job. Good on them. I think that's great. But you still got to tell a story. It doesn't mean you have the thing wound up with full colour, saturation. That's fine if you're Pixar, and you want that sort of, head-banging sort of colour sort of thing. But the thing is, we've got a choice. We can mute the whole thing. We can, and whatever we do artistically, if we mute the colours, or we amp the colours up, or we make it dark, or we make it very pastel and white and cloudy and foggy, we're going to be able to see it all. Our palette has just gotten bigger. The range it's falling off the edge of the TV set. It's fantastic, I think.
That is a great answer, and I like to think that the very good ones are only going to get better with this technology. Fantastic.
Well, look at Chipo. When I first saw his Et tu m'as tambien, I thought this guy really knows what he's doing. He's just a great cinematographer. As Mexico has produced, Amores Perez, Rodrigo Perez. Like those two guys, there's several others that they just understand image making and storytelling, and they're using all the tools to
Took 3 Oscars in a row: Gravity, Birdman, and now Revenant. So that's
amazing.
Yeah, phenomenal. Just going back to that question very quickly, Patrick, do you see some competition in terms of HDR technology and who's going to win out?
Well, there's an old saying, success has many fathers and failures an orphan. Clearly, the fact that everyone now is saying, oh yeah, I'm doing HDR, is an affirmation that HDR is really real. So we're gratified, and we're glad to see the industry actually, rising up to meet the challenge. We think that, there is no competition. We are best of class. I think LG's agreed with that. We're now doing our 23rd cinema in Dolby Vision, 23rd movie in Dolby Vision. Jungle Book will be coming out from Disney. And the Dolby Vision cinemas are beginning to grow around the world. So on the cinema side, we think that we are the right solution. Hollywood is embracing it. So that part of the ecosystem, we think, is something that we're doing very well. We continue to show leadership there. And it's now trickling all the way down through the ecosystem, as Grant mentioned, to the consumer side. So yeah, you can, you have to decide as a consumer, what kind of quality of content that you can have. But if you want the best, there's clearly nothing better than we have right now. So
very good answer. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Grant, Patrick, and Peter. Amazing insight, and truly, these two gentlemen here are driving the film industry. So it is so amazing to have them with us. Just to wrap up, we're going to have some light refreshments, a drink. Feel free to have something to eat.